Hello, my name is Mark Tarnopolsky. I'm a neuromuscular and neurometabolic physician at McMaster University. I treat patients with FSH muscular dystrophy. We have about 170 patients that we see on a regular basis, and I've done quite a bit of research into the area of therapies, both nutritional, pharmacological, and exercise therapies for patients with a number of neuromuscular disorders. I've been to South Africa once. It was a lovely occasion. I went to Kruger. I wish I was down there with you now. And hopefully at some point I can come down and actually meet people in person. For now, with the wonders of Zoom, I'm going to just share my screen and go for a presentation talking about exercise and nutritional interventions. So as mentioned, I'm going to talk about exercise and nutritional therapies for FSH muscular dystrophy. I'm Mark Tarnopolsky, as mentioned. I'm a professor of pediatrics and medicine at McMaster University, and I focus on neuromuscular and neurometabolic disorders. I've given several talks over the years just from a disclosure perspective to some pharmaceutical companies. Most importantly, I'm the founder and CEO of Exerkine Corporation and Stay Above Nutrition. We've developed a number of supplements which improve muscle strength and function in older adults. And some of these we are seeing whether they're of benefit to our patients with neuromuscular and neurometabolic disorders. In Canada, we have discount codes for everyone so that we don't make any profit off any of our patients. And unfortunately, we're not selling anything yet in South Africa, but I'll show you how in South Africa or in any country in the world, there are several supplements that we think could be helpful, and we'll talk about those. So we're very focused on the mitochondria. That's probably the one area of expertise that people would know me for in the world. But the mitochondria are important in pretty much every process in the body. They're part of human aging. And as we get older, our mitochondria are not working properly. But in FSH, there's quite a bit of data that the mitochondria are not working properly. And the mitochondrial dysfunction can contribute to muscle atrophy, and it can contribute to oxidative stress, which is a particular target in FSH dystrophy, which I'd like to talk about. Over the years, I've been very interested in trying to figure out what the molecular underpinnings are that lead to muscle hypertrophy, and also how we can improve mitochondrial mass by increasing what's called mitochondrial biogenesis, which is the formation of new mitochondria. We've taken what we've learned with nutrition, exercise, and drugs to try and promote athletes and older adults to apply to our patients with different disorders, including mitochondrial disease and muscular dystrophy. We've applied this also to other disorders where mitochondrial dysfunction is secondary, such as obesity, type 2 diabetes, sarcopenia, which is the loss of muscle mass with aging, and even immobilization. So if people are in a cast or have surgery, they can lose up to 25% of their mitochondria and 4% of their muscle mass every 2 weeks, which is quite dramatic. As mentioned, the mitochondria really are important in so many cellular functions. We think they're really an important target to try and treat in various muscle disorders and aging. When mitochondria don't work properly, there's something called telomeres, which can shorten. Telomeres essentially are a cap on the end of our chromosomes, and as we replicate them, as they shorten, the telomeres get smaller, and that can lead to the cell essentially stopping working, called cellular senescence, which I've shown you here. When mitochondria don't work, there's a process called apoptosis, which is pre-programmed cell death, which can get activated. To build new proteins, such as muscle, we need to keep protein synthesis going. That's a very ATP or energy-dependent process, and if the mitochondria don't work, protein don't synthesize, and it can contribute to atrophy. When there's dysfunction of the mitochondria, we activate inflammation, and we lead to something called oxidative stress. So many of you have heard of things called free radicals, and that's what antioxidants are meant to mop up, and that is enhanced when mitochondria don't work. And all of these can lead to the cells essentially becoming zombie-like and not working, which leads to muscle atrophy. So in aging, this is important because every first world country and most emerging populations, we're seeing a greater and greater proportion of people over the age of 65. This is the US, where by 2025, it's estimated about 25% of the population will be over the age of 65. And these are the states where that's expected to be particularly problematic. So we know for healthy individuals, regular physical activity is important. And given that most of our patients with FSH dystrophy are living normal lifespan, it's important to think about the benefits of regular exercise, not just to the muscles, but also to all-cause mortality. It's estimated that if people exercise 3 times a week for 30 minutes, where is moderately vigorous, you're having difficulties carrying on a conversation, that will lower your all-cause mortality and or give you about 4 years lifespan extension. But in addition to the benefits for heart disease, which everyone is very familiar with, even cancers and other disorders like dementia, depression, and even hip fractures are lower for those who regularly exercise. So it's important, I think, for anyone with neuromuscular disease, especially those who have a normal lifespan or close to a normal lifespan, to think about the benefits, not just to the muscles, but also to a variety of other disorders. So this is a study which shows how patients who have FSH muscular dystrophy can have oxidative stress and mitochondrial dysfunction. And again, this is an excellent group who's published a lot on this area out of France. And what this shows here is in patients who have FSH muscular dystrophy versus those who are healthy age-matched controls, there are a variety of different biochemical markers which indicate that there's more oxidative stress. So this is oxidative damage to lipids. This is another marker, and this is a marker to what's called protein. Now, the cell tries to increase antioxidants, but in spite of increasing the antioxidants at the cell level, we still see that there's increased oxidative stress. And again, this is in patients with FSH muscular dystrophy. What they showed also is that patients with FSH muscular dystrophy showed evidence of mitochondrial dysfunction. So when they looked at individual muscle fibers, there was more poor or dysfunctional mitochondria. And you can see that as lower numbers here versus here across a whole bunch of metrics showing that there's mitochondrial dysfunction. This is another way of looking at it to show also that when you have poor mitochondria, your function is not very good. So what they showed here is that with poor mitochondria, there was evidence that that was related to weaker muscles. And also here, markers of inflammation were also related to weaker muscles. Also, markers of oxidative stress were even correlated with a poor function on the 2-minute walk test. And this is what it looks like. So these are patients with FSH dystrophy. These are patients who are controls. And this is the accumulation of oxidatively damaged proteins in the muscle called lipofuscin. You can see much more in age and sex matched patients versus controls. And this is occurring around the skin of the muscle called the sarcolemma. Now, what can we do about all of this? Well, certainly exercise training is of benefit. We and others have shown that in older adults, we can increase strength, we can increase functional capacity, we can increase muscle mass, and improve mitochondria. We also lower oxidative stress and inflammation. And we and others have shown this in a variety of studies. People have looked at exercise training and FSH, but unfortunately, no study has really looked at strength training yet, even though it has great potential to improve function. But this is my friend and colleague, Dr. Vissing from Denmark, who did a study in patients with FSH dystrophy. They had 41 men and women. They did 3 minutes, 3 times per week of cycloergometry. So that's being on a bike, but anything's going to work. If it's rowing, treadmill exercise, cycloergometry, all of these things, elliptical would all be similar types of activity. What they looked at was to see whether adding extra protein to their diet was of any benefit. And what they showed here is that there was an improvement in fitness in those who took protein and exercise versus those who just exercised versus control. Now, it wasn't statistically significant, but those who took the protein seemed to have almost twice the benefit in some of these outcomes and a slightly greater benefit for other outcomes. But with a small sample size, adding protein wasn't statistically beneficial, but for some things, there did seem to be a greater benefit. No improvement or worsening when they were on control over that time period. Definite improvement with any type of exercise, and possibly a small increase if they took extra protein. So small improvements like this seem to be beneficial in the long run. So we know with healthy aging that people lose muscle strength over time. Of course, patients with FSH start off with greater weakness, depending on the muscle you're looking at, especially the shoulder girdle muscle, the lower abdominal muscles, the back muscles, and in some cases, the front muscle for your shin called the tibialis anterior. So if we can get a small improvement in exercise, which has been well documented, it may not seem like a lot, but a little bit of benefit goes a long way over time. And this is trying to keep people above the disability threshold. Now, in our clinic, we quantitatively measure strength. And what we find is on a biodex dynamometer, where we're kicking the leg out, we can measure the knee extension. So this is an example of knee extension weakness. And we know when people get to 30, 50% of people need a cane. When we get to 20, 50% of people need a walker. And at 10, 50% of people need a wheelchair. So tiny improvements go a long way to try and slow things down. So we have been working on a paper, and we haven't published this yet, but we're still analyzing the data, where we looked at patients who had FSH muscular dystrophy. But first, I'll show you our patients with myotonic that we have published. So this was a study where we looked at men and women with myotonic dystrophy, which at the cellular level has a lot of similarities to FSH muscular dystrophy. And what we showed is that those who did exercise regularly had stronger knee extension and arm flexion strength, and even their hand grip was stronger. So same age, same degree of disease, those who exercise have better strength. Now, this is our preliminary data on FSH muscular dystrophy, who are well known to have oxidative stress and mitochondrial dysfunction due to this hypomethylation of this DUX4 site, which you're probably all familiar with. We looked at 10 patients who exercised on a regular basis with FSH retrospectively. So this was an average of 10 years. And then we had 9 patients who did no exercise at all. And you can see that there was almost no change in knee extension strength in those who exercised regularly. And by that, we mean at least 3 times per week for half an hour. Quite a substantial drop, in those who did no exercise. Arm flexion, very important for function in daily living. Almost no drop whatsoever in those that regularly exercised, and a significant drop in those who were sedentary. So again, just showing that over a long period of time, a small change, which is almost not measurable over the first couple of years, but over time, we really start to see this separation of disability arising from the muscle weakness. So we do know from aging, where we and others have many, many studies showing improvements in strength, endurance, quality of life, and what we call body composition. So more muscle, less fat. And we've shown multiple times with muscle biopsies that there's improved mitochondrial function, lower oxidative stress, and lower inflammation. It's been quite well documented in mitochondrial disease. In FSH, they've not done any studies with weight training yet. And with endurance training, we get an improvement in endurance, but that doesn't translate to strength as yet. Again, I think, as we recommend for most patients, a combination of exercise, nutrition, and mixing both endurance with resistance is the optimal study. We're learning a lot more about myotonic dystrophy, and we've certainly shown definite improvements in endurance. A group in Quebec has shown improvements in strength with weight training, and we definitely have shown in our study that they get more muscle and less fat. So let's talk about patients' dietary needs and some nutritional assessment and interventions. So this was a study we published years ago looking at 51 patients with muscular dystrophy. About a third of them had FSH dystrophy. What we did is we analyzed their diet twice, separated by 5 months, and we compared it to the Canadian recommended intake. What we found is because people tend not to do as much activity and exercise, their energy intake was low. And if your energy intake is low, you're not pulling in as much diversity of food, and many people had vitamin and mineral deficiencies. So what we found is, you can see here a variety of different vitamins and minerals were below the Canadian recommended intake. 16% were below the sedentary recommended intake, but we recommend about 50% more protein for people with muscular dystrophy, and that puts this number at over 60% aren't getting enough. What's interesting is about 20% were obese and 9% were underweight. So there's no uniform, everyone's overweight or everyone's underweight with muscular dystrophy. We have both people who are overweight and underweight. And I'll show you that in a little bit more detail in a minute. So we actually measured vitamin levels in a variety of our different muscle disorders. And this is the same across mitochondrial disease, neuropathy, and muscular dystrophy. And that is that about 13% of our patients are vitamin B12 deficient, about 8% folate deficient, and around 10% or so are vitamin D deficient. And that's severe vitamin D deficiency, less than 30 nanomoles, which can cause osteoporosis and muscle weakness. However, if we look at vitamin D, current guidelines in Canada are much higher than what's needed to prevent rickets. And most of our patients are taking 2,000 units because 85% of our patients are insufficient in vitamin D. So for a lot of patients, because energy intake is low, they're not getting a full complement and a balanced nutrition, and that can be a challenge to get your vitamins and minerals. So we generally would recommend that if people are having problems with swallowing, which isn't so much of an issue with FSH dystrophy as it is with IBM or myotonic, but if you do have difficulty chewing and swallowing, get a swallowing study done. Because of our last study, we recommend taking a balanced multivitamin, Centrum, whatever balanced multivitamin you have in your country. And we always recommend that neurologists check for deficiencies. It's easy to treat a deficiency, and it's better to nip it in the bud before you let it become more advanced. So vitamin B12, vitamin D, we check in most of our patients. Iron stores to make sure that iron stores are adequate. And if they're low, it's easy to replace these and replace that deficiency. And remember, of course, that everyone attributes any decline in function in a rare disease to the disease itself, but don't forget about deficiencies and or things that are common like hypothyroidism, which are treatable. So another thing we and others have been interested in is something called creatine. So back in 1999, we actually did muscle biopsies from people with mitochondrial disease, muscular dystrophy, and inflammatory muscle disorders. And across all of them, we saw that the creatine and phosphocreatine were about 20 to 30% lower on average and quite substantially low in some patients. So what is creatine? Well, creatine is it's called a guanidino compound that is made from the pancreas and kidneys. So we combine two amino acids called arginine and glycine, which makes guanidino acetate, which goes to the liver. A methyl group is added from methionine, and we make creatine. It's taken up into our muscle and excreted as creatinine through the kidneys. We also get creatine from our diet. So if we have meat or fish, we get creatine in the diet. If you're a vegan vegetarian, you get no creatine whatsoever in your diet. And in fact, people have shown that even cognition improves when vegan vegetarians are given creatine. Apologize for that. So that's where creatine comes from, but we can also take it as a supplement. So especially if people have a low meat intake, it would make sense. But what about patients with muscular dystrophy? We just showed that a fairly high proportion had low levels in their muscle. You've probably heard of CK, that's the muscle enzyme, which is released in response to muscle damage, which maybe how some of you were diagnosed because the CK was found to be high. That's important in creatine metabolism. So the creatine is leaking out of the muscle, and that's why the levels are low. However, is there benefit to taking creatine if you have muscular dystrophy? Well, we know in young people and older adults that it improves your muscle mass. It activates a stem cell called a satellite cell. Many studies have shown that if you exercise train with creatine, you gain more strength and muscle mass. It's also an antioxidant. And keep in mind, I just showed you that with FSH, there's an increase in oxidative stress, and it can improve mitochondrial dysfunction. Keep in mind, I just told you that patients with FSH have increased mitochondrial dysfunction. So this is a study from my colleague, Dr. Maggie Walter. This is 36 patients, so 1/3 of them had FSH dystrophy. It was a randomized double-blind study where people took 10 grams of creatine as an adult, 5 for pediatrics, and they showed that the MRC, which is your muscle strength test, went up after creatine, and they felt better, so the neuromuscular symptom score had improved. So Maggie Walter showed this in her study with FSH patients. We and others have done studies in other muscular dystrophy groups. We studied Duchenne dystrophy and found an 8% increase in strength. We also found an increase in muscle mass. Others have shown something similar, but to look at this in more detail, people analyzed something called a Cochrane review, where all papers came together and this was analyzed through what's called a meta-analysis. The average improvement was 8.5% in strength and almost a pound of muscle mass. Now, keep in mind, small improvements over a long period of time can have significant benefit. So this has been shown in a Cochrane review to be of benefit. We recommend generally 1 heaping teaspoon or 2 level teaspoons every day in our patients with muscle disease, and that should keep your creatine stores adequate. So our company, as I mentioned before, has interest in sarcopenia, which is muscle loss with aging, type 2 diabetes, and obesity. We've done many studies over the years with creatine, protein, especially with Duchenne. We've found the benefits of creatine, as have others in FSH dystrophy. We're looking now at a combination of different proteins, creatine, and other things in myotonic. And we've got a grant in, fingers crossed, that we get this with FSH muscular dystrophy to see if a combination of a variety of things to enhance muscle strength are beneficial. So one of my colleagues, Stu Phillips, did a study a few years ago in older adults where he reviewed the world literature to say, well, what's the best supplements that have been shown to improve muscle strength in older adults? And they came up with creatine, whey protein, vitamin D, calcium, and fish oil, omega-3s and fish oil. So omega-3 from plant is useless. It does not have any benefits, but the fish oil extracts, anything that's got the EPA and the DHA is where the benefit comes from. So we actually repeated Stu's study, and this is what we've commercialized. So we came up with this stuff called Muscle 5 combined with omega-3. So we did a study on 32 older men over the age of 65, and we compared them to half of the men on collagen, half of them took this supplement. So it's very similar to what Dr. Phillips came up with. The only thing we changed is we added whey and casein instead of just whey, and we dropped the protein content to 40 grams a day, not 60, which Stu had, because we thought 60 was just a little too high for most people to take. The reason we went with the whey and casein is milk-based protein was evolutionarily selected when humans diverged from reptiles and birds about 200 million years ago. Reptiles and birds used egg white to grow their young, and mammals use milk. What's interesting is whey protein stimulates protein synthesis and casein attenuates protein degradation, and that really is the optimal combination. So what we found in our study was very similar to Stu's. We improved strength, we improved functional tasks, so getting up from a chair. And this is what we found here. So the body fat with this supplement went down a little bit. It was statistically significant, but the more important thing is that we could improve muscle mass. So you can see here all these little stars. This just means that any way we look at muscle mass, it got better when they took the supplement. Keep in mind that this placebo isn't actually a placebo, it was collagen. So a lot of people are familiar with collagen and people spend a lot of money on it, but it really did absolutely nothing at all from a strength or muscle mass perspective. We showed greater improvements in leg press, grip strength, and we even showed that the functional tasks got better with this supplement. So this is the study by Stu Phillips. They've also shown lower markers of inflammation. So what Stu showed is that after about 3 months on the supplement, inflammation went down. And these are 2 markers of inflammation. So it's actually third, this one here went down as well. So again, as I mentioned before, there's increased inflammation, mitochondrial dysfunction, and oxidative stress in patients with FSH dystrophy. And again, taking a balanced protein supplement with omega-3s and creatine. Now, this is not available in South Africa, but essentially it's pretty straightforward. 2 level teaspoons or 1 heaping teaspoon of creatine, 40 grams of milk-based protein. Now, you could always substitute whey in it. It's probably not quite as good, but it's pretty darn close. Calcium, you just need to take 2 Tums or Rolaids tablets. Vitamin D, we recommend that all patients take 2,000 units a day. The omega-3 is, and you can get this pretty much any drugstore and most grocery stores in South Africa, 2 level teaspoons of this per day we recommend. So again, so many of these disorders share this mitochondrial dysfunction as the final common pathway, leading to these biochemical processes, which have been shown time and again are a function in many muscular dystrophies, especially in FSH dystrophy. So this is interesting. A group in France actually is aware, and they're the group I mentioned to you before, discovered this oxidative stress, inflammation, and mitochondrial dysfunction. So they came up with a randomized double-blind trial to look at this. They had 53 FSH patients, randomized trial where they were on a supplement or placebo for 17 weeks. Their supplement to target oxidative stress was vitamin C, vitamin E, zinc, and methionine. They looked at oxidative stress, 2-minute walk test, strength and endurance. And what they found essentially is those who took the supplement had a greater improvement. That's what this p-value here is for the 2-minute walk test. And the maximal voluntary strength wasn't quite significantly different because it was significant for both. But it's this functional test of the 2-minute walk test that was really different. And they also did a timed test as well, which is a little bit better. But the big thing really is this 2-minute walk test showed better improvement in those on the supplement versus placebo. What we found is we think is probably a better combination from an antioxidant perspective, because they found very minimal changes from lowering oxidative stress. So we did a study in mitochondrial disease patients, and this is what we're applying for to the Canadian government to combine this with good quality protein and the fish oil in patients with FSH. All of our patients were recommending take this because it's a tried and true antioxidant. So we use CoQ10, which is a mitochondrial antioxidant, vitamin E, creatine, and this alpha lipoic acid, which is another mitochondrial antioxidant. And we studied patients with definite mitochondrial disease. And what we showed is that the CoQ10 went up, oxidative stress markers went down, mitochondrial function improved as reflected by lowering lactate, and another marker of oxidative stress went down. So these can be purchased in most health food stores and most drugstores. For our FSH patients, we're recommending 200 milligrams of alpha lipoic acid twice a day, 200 milligrams of CoQ10 twice a day. Creatine, we've already talked about that. That would be 3 to 5 grams per day, which is 2 level teaspoons or 1 heaping teaspoon. And vitamin E, 400 international units twice a day. So this is available at most health food stores across the world, and I'm sure we can get that. You can get that in South Africa. So we've also been interested in a concept called sarcopenic obesity, and that is that older adults get skinnier muscles and they put on more fat. In the old days, people would say, well, you convert your your muscle into fat. That's not true. We just get smaller muscles, and our body fat, like our subcutaneous adipose tissue, gets larger. So it appears that way, but it's really that we're just putting on more fat and getting skinnier from our muscles. Some people call this sarcopenic obesity, but we've seen this in our patients. So these are patients with muscular dystrophy. We have many more numbers here, and it just keeps coming out the same. And that is, these are FSH patients, but we have now 20 FSH patients all in this gray range. And what this reflects is that people have probably heard of the BMI, which essentially your your weight over your height in meters squared. And so that is a accepted World Health Organization metric of obesity. However, it doesn't work for our patients. And what you can see here is some of these individuals are told that they're underweight, but in fact, they're obese. So when we actually measure body fat with a DEXA scan, what we have in gray is the proportion of patients who are obese by DEXA scan, which is the gold standard. But what's happening is the BMI is saying that they are normal or underweight. And so many of our patients have excess body fat, probably because you're not moving quite as much, and thin muscles. So we've talked about how to improve people's muscle mass. But now what we need to think about is, what about losing a bit of body fat? So we did a study where we looked at mice who were fed a high-fat diet to make them obese. We put them on intervention of placebo, which is just a high-fat diet, or high-fat diet plus a whole bunch of different combinations. So we had our mitochondrial enhancer, but we also added a few weight loss components to it. And we came up with the essential 7 ingredients. And what we found, these are mice who are on a controlled diet. These are mice on the high-fat diet. Keep feeding them fat, they get fatter. Exercise them, they lose weight. So absolutely, exercise is important, not just to build your muscle, but to stay lean and to decrease your cardiovascular risk factors. Our 7 essential components here definitely lowered body fat, but when we combined it with exercise, it was dramatically beneficial. So it enhanced the benefits of exercise. So at the end of the day, exercise we think is the most important. We're putting all of our patients on ALA, CoQ10, vitamin E. We didn't see weight loss just with this, but when we added some green tea and green coffee extract and a mint extract called forskolin and some beetroot, which contains nitrates, we saw this very significant loss of body fat. We've now done a clinical trial with this in overweight and obese individuals, showing that there is a reduction in body fat, but not muscle. Everyone's probably familiar with Ozempic or drugs like it, which decrease your desire to eat, but people often lose muscle mass. In this case, we did not lose muscle, just body fat. So we look here at the body fat itself. I won't get too much into it, but we turn on mitochondria. And this is our clinical trial in overweight individuals. So this combination of 7 ingredients we call TRIM7. Again, we're not selling in South Africa, but you could probably come up with most of those ingredients over the counter. At the minimum, we'd recommend those antioxidants, the alpha-lipoic acid, CoQ10, vitamin E, and creatine in FSH dystrophy. But you can see here that many more people who took the supplement versus a placebo. And again, this was randomized, double-blind, and an independent third party held the codes till the study was over. We also showed a decrease in markers of fatty liver. We have a big grant in to see if we can expand this further because there's no currently accepted drug for fatty liver disease. So for FSH dystrophy, as I mentioned, the creatine, vitamin E, CoQ10, alpha-lipoic acid, increased protein to about 50% above the South African guidelines. So we recommend 1.2 grams per kilogram per day. Again, be thinking about egg whites, and actually eating whole eggs is still very good from a protein synthesis perspective. Milk-based protein, yogurts, milk-based protein in them. If you're a vegan, you're going to have a possible time to load your creatine. You really should be on creatine, and you should be seeing a dietitian to get a good balance of proteins, because it's much more difficult if you're a vegan vegetarian. Lacto-ovo, meaning you eat eggs and milk, no problems because those are good biological value. We recommend endurance exercise 3 times a week for 30 to 40 minutes and resistance exercise. So we have created specifics on exercise for FSH dystrophy under a YouTube video that you all can take a look at. So if you go to YouTube and you enter in the neuromuscular junction with Dr. Mark Tarnopolsky, you can go in and you can see our FSH specific exercises. So please take a look at that and sign up to our YouTube video, because as we add new ones, you'll be notified. We are, as I mentioned, working on this study, fingers crossed, that we get the grant through CIHR, where we're doing home-based exercise. We've got a multi-ingredient supplement, and we've applied to CIHR for FSH. We did get a grant for myotonic dystrophy type 1. That is starting right now. Whatever works for them is almost certainly going to work for FSH. But of course, we would like to follow people carefully, and we're going to tweak it a little bit for FSH and really emphasize both methylation of DUX4, and we're also emphasizing the antioxidant component. So I just wanted to thank all the people in the lab, our clinic, our international collaborators, local collaborators, and all the folks that have funded the research. So if anyone has questions, we will definitely take any questions. I can answer them through email. We'll collect them all up, and I'll do one big sort of summary answer to each one of your questions. What we can do also is perhaps record another YouTube where I go through all of your questions, and then we can do that. That might be easiest, so I can address the questions with another similar recording. So again, I wish I could be with you. I am on holiday at the time when you'll be seeing this, so I pre-recorded it, but I'd be delighted to answer any questions. Hope you learned something. Thank you very much. Have a great day. Thanks again.